Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now live stream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community to talk about timely and important topics. Increasingly, the economic outlook is dominated by discussion of shortages, from raw materials to computer chips to labor, and whether these are driving a temporary or possibly permanent uptick in inflation. The stakes are high because if inflation proves more durable than markets currently expect, we'll likely see Fed action to boost interest rates, which could have cascading effects on demand and economic activity. Tonight, we tackle these issues with Greg DeCroix, the Granger Professor in Supply Chain Management at the Wisconsin School of Business, and Kim Ruhl, the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Chair in Economics and the Associate Director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. Thanks for joining us tonight. Kicking us off tonight is Greg DeCroix. Greg is the Granger Professor in Supply Chain Management at the Wisconsin School of Business. His research focuses on managing risk, utilizing information, and analyzing the impact of decentralized decision-making on supply chain efficiency. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including Management Science, Operations Research, IIE Transactions, and the European Journal of Operations Research. He received his PhD from Stanford University, and he was on the faculty at Duke before he moved to the Wisconsin School of Business. Thanks for joining us tonight, Greg. We look forward to hearing your thoughts about what's going on in supply chains around the globe.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to be here. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of the shortages that we're continuing to have in the world of goods, and talk about some of the supply chain frameworks that'll help us understand why some of those are still there, and then talk a little bit also about the price pressures we're seeing. So if you can go ahead and pull up the slides. I'm going to start with the good news. We have toilet paper. That wasn't the case about a year ago, but for consumers, this is pretty plentiful these days. It's actually not good if you're a company like Kimberly-Clark that sells this product. Their consumer tissue unit had sales drop by about 14% in the first quarter, which largely mirrors what they saw as a spike in the first quarter of 2020. So that's not surprising. People had hoarded, and now that it's plentiful, people are just using up what they had stored. Next slide. But the news isn't that good across the board. The headlines are still containing lots of stories about shortages and slowdowns and delays of lots of different products. And here are just a few. Semiconductors, chips going into electronics and automobiles, furniture having long lead times. If you have a pool, chlorine might be something that you find is getting a little bit pinched this summer in terms of availability. And things like shipping containers. To some extent a shortage, but certainly an imbalance of where those shipping containers are in the world. Again, there are lots of different shortages that we have out there. Let's think about why those shortages are occurring. Next. So the goal of supply chain management at its core is really quite simple. It's trying to match supply with demand. Making that happen is much more challenging. And so a lot of these shortages and delays that we're seeing are due to one of these things. Either supply is at least temporarily constrained somewhat, and so we don't have as much as demand is asking for, or demand has surged or shifted in some unexpected way and outstripped supply. Those are two common things we think about, but I also, from a supply chain perspective, want us to also think a little bit about the connections between supply and demand, those things behind the scenes that allow us to bring product from its source to where it's demanded. And with bottlenecks and things occurring in those, even if you have enough supply to meet demand, you might still have shortages and delays because of the friction that's happening within the supply chain. Next. So let's start with one that's in the news a lot these days, semiconductors. This is a big issue for a ton of different industries. And let's kind of walk through this by starting on the left-hand side of this slide. Think back to just over a year ago, spring of 2020, what was going on? The pandemic was really taking hold in the US. Lots of shutdowns were happening, lots of plants were being shut down. In particular, the auto industry, you may recall, was using some of its capacities to start building ventilators for hospital patients. They certainly weren't doing much in the way of producing of cars. People weren't driving very much, and so they weren't interested in buying cars. And so the auto industry really did a lot of cutting back and canceling orders they had placed with semiconductor manufacturers. In a sense, that was good because the home electronics industry was absolutely exploding. As everybody was working from home, everybody needed to upgrade their equipment. And so the chip manufacturers just shifted and met that market need and pulled back from the auto industry. Now, if you move forward by even as little as 3 to 6 months, the auto industry really started to come back. And they were starting to reopen plants. The problem was the chip capacity was already largely consumed by other industries that were using them. So now we have a lot of demand growing in the auto industry, still high demand in electronics, and we really have kind of a demand-driven shortage. Chip capacity even if chip capacity hadn't changed much, we still might be outstripping that capacity because of this surge in demand. So that's a demand-focused shortage. Next. Unfortunately, the semiconductor manufacturers also were getting hit on the supply side, and still are to this day. Taiwan is actually currently having one of their worst COVID outbreaks since the pandemic started. Malaysia is also getting hit pretty hard. Generally speaking, in Southeast Asia, the vaccination rates are lagging far behind where they are in the US and Western Europe. And so we have workers falling ill or being quarantined. And, for example, Malaysia is looking at a pretty significant short-term cut in output in semiconductors based on these sorts of factors. But I also don't want us to forget that, and this is something I'll touch on a couple of times, COVID isn't the only thing that's been happening. Unfortunately, the timing was bad. There's a large semiconductor manufacturer, Renesas Electronics, that had a big fire in one of their plants northeast of Tokyo. And that's a major supplier of the auto industry. Something that doesn't appear to have had much of an impact yet, but could if things continue to worsen, is that Taiwan is going through a huge drought right now. I think I read that this monsoon season was the first in about 50 years where they didn't actually have a monsoon. And so their semiconductors take a lot of water to produce, and they're trucking in water at times. They have had a little bit of rain lately, but if that drought worsens, we could really see that impacting the semiconductor production in Taiwan, which is a major global source of semiconductors. So that's more of a supply constraint on top of the demand challenges that the industry was already facing. And just, industry we're all familiar with, the auto industry. I mentioned that in a previous slide, but this is definitely an industry that's getting hit hard by this. One example is Ford. Their F-Series pickup trucks are huge sellers. This line of trucks accounts for over $40 billion in annual revenue in a typical year. And as I say on the slide, that's more than the 4 major sports leagues combined. This is a huge product, and so they protect it as much as possible. But they did, in fact, even have to go so far as to shut down temporarily a couple of F-150 plants because they just ran out of chips and couldn't produce those. And overall, Ford is looking at a second quarter production that is only about half of what they had originally planned to produce in the company. Inventory on dealer lots is way down, less than half of what it typically is. And so you have consumers even paying over MSRP and really practically getting into a bidding war for cars, which then has a spillover effect into the used car market. And so prices there are surging as well. Next. So I've touched a little bit on supply and demand sides of this. I don't want to forget about the connections in the middle. These are things that you might not think that much about on a daily basis. But cardboard boxes, wood pallets, shipping containers, these are things that are critical pieces, kind of the grease that keeps the gears moving in our supply chains that allows things to get to consumers. As we went into pandemic and a lot of us were buying more things online, that of course led to an explosion in the demand for cardboard boxes, but also warehouse space was being expanded and more wooden pallets were needed to kind of store some of these goods that people were purchasing. And just a quick peek ahead, in a moment, I'll say something about the lumber industry. Guess what the raw material is for wooden pallets and cardboard boxes? It's softwood lumber, just like it is for building materials. In the shipping container situation, the pandemic hit China first, and then industries there opened up quicker than they did here. We were farther down the line on the calendar. And so as we were buying a lot of things online as US consumers, and in particular, we were buying things, period, because, you couldn't go to bars, couldn't go to restaurants, you couldn't travel. There wasn't as much being spent in the service sector. So we started buying goods. A lot of those goods come from China. And as a result, the number of containers coming to the US across the Pacific is much greater than the number of containers going back, because our industries were largely shut down. So the output of goods going back to China was quite low proportionally. This increase in demand for goods that stems from the lowering of demand for services also led to just more ships coming across. And at the same time, you had labor restrictions, you had workplace restrictions to try to reduce the spread of COVID going on in ports and other sorts of places. And so you have reduced capacity to handle the ships, more ships coming in. The natural response is you get these queues building up, and you have lots of ships queued up in the Pacific off the West Coast. And just to make things worse, guess what's sitting on those ships, not really serving anybody? Shipping containers. So a lot of them are getting locked up in those ships that are being delayed. So a lot of different things going on that are related to how things move that are exacerbating the problems of even having the right supply and demand. Next. Just a couple of quick graphs related to price as a result of this. This is a graph of the Freightos Baltic Container Index. It's an index. It's a composite of 12 different shipping routes and what it costs to ship a 40-foot shipping container on an ocean vessel. And you can see from the graph, a couple of years ago, we're down well under $2,000, and more recently, it spiked up above $6,000. So it's much more costly to ship things because of some of these factors I've been talking about. Next. This is a similar, little bit less extreme, looking at the paper that's used to make corrugated boxes. And so when you look at the impact, going back 6-8 years ago, we're looking somewhere in the $600 range for this these futures, and now we're looking out, north of $800 for this. So not as extreme, but still upward price pressure on the cardboard boxes. Next. And I could go on and on with examples. Unfortunately, we're seeing lots of different pressures. If they're not out and out shortages, they're at least strains that are causing price increases. Gasoline, I haven't talked much about labor. Kim will talk much more about that in a moment. But what happened when the pandemic hit? Well, people stopped driving. That lowered demand for cars, as I said before, but it also dramatically lowered demand for gasoline. So the gasoline industry cut back on their business. A lot of truckers left that industry because there wasn't work for them. And it's not just as simple as turning a switch and having them show up then once you want to start expanding the business again, as people are now starting to drive a lot more. And so that sort of constraint has helped to drive gas prices up from just about $2 a gallon to about $3 a gallon. Building materials is something that has gotten a lot of press as well. People were stuck at home looking around saying, hey, I could make this look better. I'm going to be stuck here. That with low interest rates and some cutbacks also in production capacity due to COVID, you have prices for home building materials, lumber and things like that skyrocketing. Rental cars, I don't know how many of you have tried to rent a car recently, but the prices are pretty steep these days. Again, people stopped traveling. Rental fleets were hemorrhaging cash, so they actually sold off about a third of the rental fleet in order to try to preserve some cash and stay afloat. But now when people are coming back, it's difficult to immediately replace those vehicles, especially as I mentioned, since the auto industry is being constrained because the chip industry has been constrained and so on. So you start to see some of these real interconnectedness within the supply chain where one kind of a shortage or of a pinch point can ripple through and affect a lot of different products. Next. And I want to remind you that there's more going on in the world than COVID. This has been a really weird year for supply chain. Remember the winter storm in Texas that knocked out a lot of power? One of the things that did is it cut into the supply of polyurethane foam that's used in furniture and mattresses and things of that nature. So that put price pressures and shortages on that industry. We had a ship get stuck in the Suez Canal. We had a ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline in terms of the gas supply up and down the East Coast. So if you're feeling particularly generous, I would say find your favorite supply chain professional, send them a box of chocolates or at least a nice note or something, because it's been a really incredible year. And the fact that we don't have more dramatic shortages and that we can often find many of the things we need is a real testament to the hard work of people working in a tough industry in a very challenging time period. Next. So I'll try to end on a slightly higher note. Things will and do eventually stabilize. Auto plants are starting to open up again. They're getting enough chips to be able to resume some of that production. Lumber prices have fallen off dramatically, so that may have been a bit of a bubble that is actually turning itself around. And I'll kind of close on that. The next slide then, which is just a graph of lumber price futures over the past year. You can see that just as of right around the beginning of May, it peaked at over $1,600 on this metric. It's down now more in the 700 range. So it's dropped by more than 50% in less than 2 months. So things can change very quickly, which makes it very challenging if you're trying to purchase the supplies that you need and manage your supply chain. These price swings can be a real challenge to deal with. But at least the hope is that lumber price drop is something that might be true of a lot of other commodities and other products in the marketplace, and that this kind of big surge in inflation that we saw in recent reports might be a somewhat temporary thing. As these supply chain professionals work hard to smooth things out, maybe the price pressures won't last. The very peak price pressures won't last all that long. So I'll stop there and I'll let Kim take it over from there.
Well, Greg, before we do that, let me just say I've got the team trying to front run any box of chocolate shortages that might ensue from your comments, and we'll get you a box very quickly.
I would not be surprised.
You are our favorite supply chain professional. So thanks for being here.
Sure.
Our next guest is Kim Ruhl, the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Chair in Economics, and the Associate Director of CROW, the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. His research focuses on international economics, models of firm heterogeneity, and national income accounting. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a special sworn employee of the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, where he studies the ways that multifunctional firms produce and sell goods and services around the world. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota, and we are glad to have him at Wisconsin. Thank you, Kim, for joining us, and please fill us in on what's happening in the labor market.
Sure, thanks for having me. If you just pop up the first slide, we'll get it started. So I want to talk about a few things today. I want to start just by talking a bit about just how labor markets kind of work during recoveries. I would say that we're kind of in the middle now of a recovery. We've had a recession and the economy is starting to open back up again. So talk a little bit about just sort of how those look in general, with the punchline kind of being that labor markets tend to be slow to adjust. There's sort of one of the last markets to sort of come around. Then I'll talk about some factors that are affecting labor demand and supply, and to kind of finish by talking about where we're kind of seeing some of this supply and demand mismatch, which shows up in terms of wage pressure. And we'll see those in particular showing up in kind of low-skilled industries, and in particular for new hires. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just to get us started, this is just a picture of the employment population ratio. So everybody who has a job divided by all the people in the United States, expressed as a percent. And so you can see this goes back to just the end of World War II. It starts off sort of flat and then grows in the 80s and 90s. And that largely is reflecting the integration of women into the workforce. And then it's starting to kind of have a bit of a secular downtrend since the 2000s. And a lot of that is reflecting the demographic shift, the fact that a lot of baby boomers are starting to now move out of the workforce. But obviously, the thing that sticks out the most is that pretty significant drop from about 61% to less than 52% at the end, as we've kind of shut down lots of jobs. I think that's the largest drop. But what I'd like you to look at, though, is when you look at all these different recessions. Those are the gray bars on the figure. The employment population ratio always falls, and sometimes quite sharply during the recession. But then look at how slowly it kind of recovers afterwards. And this is labor markets in general, not just when COVID happens, but typically after recessions, labor markets are kind of slow to adjust, and they're kind of one of the last markets to do so. Next slide. And so when economists try to think about why that is, some of the best theories we have are to think about labor markets as the matching markets, right? So it's easy in some sense to go out and buy a barrel of oil or a can of Coca-Cola. They're sort of all the same. So you find the first can of Coca-Cola you can find and you buy it. Think about labor markets as something more like a housing market or a dating market. You've got heterogeneous jobs. Jobs are even within a narrow kind of classification of jobs, depending on what kind of a firm you're working at, a big firm, a small firm, these jobs are different and heterogeneous workers. So even two people with the same degrees and the same number of years of experience are going to be different. They're going to value different parts of the job differently and be better at different parts of the job than others. And so labor markets are much more about trying to find a good match. Both employers and workers want to find the right jobs, the right matching. And that tends to take time and effort. I imagine most of you, just like me, have spent a lot of time trying to find the right job. And sometimes you start a job and realize this isn't quite right, and you move to the next one. And so there's a lot of sort of natural churn in the labor market as firms and workers try to match up with each other. So the fact that labor markets are kind of acting a bit funny right now in the sense that they're kind of moving slowly, and we kind of have both high unemployment, but also lots of firms looking for workers, isn't that unusual. It's just that this has been a particularly large adjustment that we're trying to make. As your typical recession, firms are recovering at different rates. And so some firms are starting to grow a little faster than others, and they're hiring some firms, and then it might take other types of firms a bit longer to start to grow and want to hire more people. And so this is kind of a slower and more gradual adjustment. Well, here, because we've basically coordinated all of the shutdown together, and now we're coordinating all of the restart together, everybody's trying to do everything at once. And so all the firms are trying to hire at once, and lots of people are trying to get back into the workforce at once. And so that's just going to slow this adjustment down kind of even more. Next slide. So to kind of get a better sense of what some of this adjustment and turnover looks like, I'm going to show you a couple of figures here. So this is the separation rate. So this is the number of separations. Those are people who either quit their job or were fired for whatever reason. They've separated from their employment as a share of total employment. And so you see that there's not a lot of cyclicality to this. This doesn't sort of fall a lot or go up a lot during the recessions. Again, the gray bars, it's kind of somewhere between 3 and 4% of employment kind of separates in a month. And like I said, some of that's voluntary separations, some of them are involuntary separations. And then you see, of course, there's this massive spike at the beginning of 2020 where about 11% of employment is suddenly not employed anymore. So that's a pretty unusual, event. Next slide. So this is kind of the flip side of it. This is the hiring rate. So this is the number of people getting hired in a month, people who are joining a firm, divided by employment. And here you can see that there is a bit more cyclicality here. So during recessions, the hiring rate tends to fall. So the reason why unemployment increases during a recession isn't that a lot more people are getting fired or laid off or quitting. It's that firms are hiring less. Right? And so that's kind of what we see here. In 2008, you can see the hiring rate falls from about 4% to about 3%. And then it's taken, almost 12 years to get back up to about 4%. That's just kind of slowly adding people back into the labor force. And then looking at the last recession, we see there's a sharp drop in hiring at the beginning of 2020, and then another sharp increase as people came back. And the hiring rate is still, almost at about 4 or 5%. I'm sorry, 4.5%. Next slide. So then this is now a measure of kind of unfilled jobs. So this is the number of job openings divided by employment plus job openings. So the total number of kind of jobs available, whether they're filled or unfilled, and then there's openings as a fraction of that. And you can see this is for the entire economy, the entire U.S. economy. That's a pretty flat, kind of right around 4.5% up until the recession. And so that's on average, there's about 7.2 million jobs needing to be filled in this period. Then again, there's a sharp dip at the beginning of the recession. It flattens back out again. And then what we're seeing at the end is this kind of big spike in firms looking to hire. And so if you've been reading the newspaper or watching the news on television, you've probably heard a lot about firms talking about worker shortages and not being able to find workers. The latest data are for April, and we can see that in April, there's about 9.3 million openings unmet. Right? So there's about 2 million more jobs trying to be filled, firms competing for 2 million more workers than they would have been kind of otherwise. Okay, so this is this is from the firm side. This is that increase in demand for workers that's not being met. Next slide. Now this is not sort of the same across industries, right? So different industries are having harder times than others in filling slots. So I've ordered these. So this is the same figure, the same statistic I was just showing you, the job opening rate, but now I'm breaking this out by different industries. And then I'm sorting them. At the top are the ones that have the largest number of unmet jobs, and the construction at the bottom is sort of has the fewest unfilled jobs. And probably not surprisingly, it's the industries that were shut down the most, or the most affected by COVID, are the ones that are now having the most trouble hiring people. And again, partially that's because this is so coordinated. We shut down food service, we shut down hotels, we shut down movie theaters and the arts all at once, and we're opening them back up again all at once. And so these firms are having a much harder time filling jobs. And you can see it, for example, in arts, entertainment, and recreation, that job opening rate is almost 12%. They're trying to hire almost 12% of their total employment back right now. Okay, and then on the sort of flip end, things like education and construction, wholesales, kind of more service industries have had a bit less of a problem with this. Everybody's having a little bit of trouble finding people, but less pressure there, because a lot of those jobs have sort of still been around even through the recession. Next slide. On the labor supply side, so we talked about how firms are going out and trying to find workers, where the work is coming from or maybe not coming from. So what are some of the forces in the labor supply? So if you've been following, the unemployment rate has been coming down pretty fast since its peak last year. The labor force participation rate, however, is still a bit low. It's still off by 1 or 2 percentage points. So people who are neither employed or out looking for work, the people who are kind of staying out of the labor market for right now. So there's lots of different things going on, and it's hard to know which ones are the most important. So I've just sort of listed some of them in no particular order. If again, talk about the effect of these extra unemployment benefits, and also I would say, and also savings. People who have had a higher than normal kind of personal income have been saving that over the last year. These are short-term issues. Extra unemployment benefits will eventually go away. Savings will eventually be spent down, and so this is a more short-term issue. But one of the things that it might be doing is that by giving people an extra, a bit of cushion, they're searching even more than they normally would, right? They're trying even harder to find exactly the right job they want. They're being more picky. There's more jobs out there. They've got some savings. They're not in such a hurry to get back into the market, and so they're looking for better jobs and kind of a better match. There's some very preliminary data, and there's a report on this at the Crow website. Noah Williams has been writing on this. There are 4 states that have have dropped their enhanced unemployment insurance benefits early. Alaska, Iowa, Mississippi, and Missouri. And there's some very early evidence, and it's noisy and it's a short sample, so I don't want to get into it too much. But that initial unemployment claims are starting to fall in those states relative to the others, which isn't terribly surprising. If you decrease the incentive to stay home, then fewer people are going to do so, and that seems like a fairly normal response to something like that. There's also been people who've been laid off, changing industries. So I leave my food service job and decide, all right, it's time to change. I've got a year. I'm going to retool. I'm going to go do something else. And so then those workers aren't going back to the industries that they came from. Concerns still about COVID and about actually getting sick. A lot of these jobs are consumer-facing jobs, right? Working in these services. That's why they were closed in the first place. And there are still some concerns about, especially with new variants showing up, that there's still some people who are reluctant to get back into the workforce. And then the last one, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end of my talk here as well, is childcare. So schools have been closed. A lot of childcare facilities have closed and not reopened. And that's always been sort of an issue with most, or oftentimes with women in the workforce, is how to deal with children. And so that, as long as that's still an issue, that's also going to depress some labor force participation. Okay, next slide. So I've talked a bit about an increased demand for workers that is being unmet. I've talked a little bit about a lower supply of workers. So supply and demand should kind of tell us that if that's the case, the just regular old market forces should create some upward pressure on wages. We should expect to see wages starting to rise in places where there are these shortages of workers or excess demand of jobs. So let's take a look and see, where do we see some of this upward wage pressure, if at all? So let's go to the next slide. So this slide's going to take a second to explain, so bear with me. This is research out of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. And so the sort of experiment here, what they're doing here is they're taking data on wages for workers from January to March of 2020, so kind of pre-pandemic wages, and then all the characteristics of workers, how old they are, how many years they've been working, their education levels, gender, race, all these things, and they're using all the data that they can to try to predict what the wage of an individual should be based on all these observable characteristics. Right? And that's what they think should have been kind of the way things would have looked pre-pandemic. So those are the gray bars. So the gray bars are some smart economists at the Atlanta Fed's best guess at what the wage should be for workers. And then the shaded bars are the actual wages reported in March of 2021, the last month that we have data. And so the left-hand panel is for workers who were continually employed. So they had worked in January and February of 2021. And then the right-hand panel is for the newly employed. So people who were employed in March 2021 but hadn't worked in the 2 months before that. And then what sort of jumps out at us is if you look on the right-hand panel, the big difference, the place where our predictions don't match the reality as well, is for the newly employed workers in low-wage service occupations. And there you see that the reported wages are almost 8% higher than they were given what we would have predicted a year ago, about an extra $1 an hour more. And so that's suggesting that what we're seeing is difficulty hiring in low-wage service occupations and hiring kind of new workers. So it's less about retaining workers that are already there. There is some increase in the wages of these continuing employed people, but that the pressure point seems to be in bringing new workers into firms in these low-wage service occupations. And then I'll finish on this last slide here next, which is just coming out from the same research, just a sort of interesting observation about how where some of these newly employed workers, this is the share of workers who are women who have a child less than 12 years of age. And you can see again in the newly employed, it's more women who have young children. And this is kind of pointing us towards again one of these factors that childcare is probably an important part of these decisions. And it's always sort of been the case that women, and particularly women with children, are the most kind of marginally attached to the workforce. They tend to come in and out more, they tend to be more responsive to changes in prices because they have this kind of important outside responsibility that can make this decision tougher. So we're starting to see some wage inflation, but particularly seems to be, for now at least, kind of concentrated in low scale service industries and for new hires. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that, and then we'll go from there.
Well, great. Thank you, Kim, for those comments. Very insightful. Both of you, great job tonight. And I'm going to go straight to some audience questions. Right out of the gate, James Rottenberg asked, what about the supply of rare earths for electronics? And does China truly have the ability to sort of corner the market in certain materials markets that are essential to production in information technology or automobiles? Any comments on that, Greg?
Yeah, a few. I'm not an expert in rare earths, so I kind of know a bit just from reading the general press. They certainly have the advantage. I don't know if they quite have the ability to corner the market. They certainly have substantially more deposits than we do, and so that does put us in a bit of a vulnerable position. Now they do exist elsewhere in the world, and so trying to make sure we have good relations with other potential suppliers is important. It's the issue of, I don't want to get too much into geopolitics here, but the issue of kind of rivalry with China is a really interesting one because there are such extraordinarily strong economic ties that, their economy earns a lot of money selling us a lot of things. And that would be a challenging thing, I think, for leadership in that country to simply decide they don't care about. That's not to say that it doesn't put us in somewhat of a vulnerable position, though.
Yeah, I always felt like the Chinese administration is more willing to inflict pain on its population than we're able to do in our democracy. But I don't know if that gives them an advantage, but you're right. It's mutual interdependence. And there's a question of how much one could push the envelope there. Kim, David Stanfield asked whether you feel wages offered to essential workers have maybe increased a bit because of the pandemic. Any knowledge of that? And I suppose it might be hard to define essential workers, but certainly healthcare workers and food production. Do we see wages rising in those sectors?
So yeah, we do to some extent, and a key sort of piece of those low-skilled services that I pointed out on those last couple of slides are exactly kind of healthcare service providers, not doctors and nurses, but other people who work in healthcare facilities. It's again, people working in grocery stores. So again, depends a bit on what you want to call an essential worker, but I think very much so. That's part of where we're starting to see some of that wage inflation, and to the extent that those frontline workers become maybe less essential as we start to recover, we'll eventually, eventually this world. It's sort of like what Greg said. Eventually, this is all going to kind of settle back down, right? We're going through a transition. Jerome Powell was talking about, this might take several months. I would imagine it might take as much as a year before the labor markets are kind of settling back down. But the economy will find its equilibrium again, and the question will be whether there's any kind of long-term inflationary pressure in these jobs.
A couple of our viewers, M. Benninger and Sue Hilty, mention changing policies, and to some extent, I suppose the change in administrations has changed policies on things like immigration and maybe other economic factors that shape the labor market. Do we see anything at this point where you'd say the change in administrations and therefore policy is having a big effect on supply chains or the labor market? Greg, anything in supply chains that sticks out?
I'll take a crack. It's a little bit early, certainly, to have much of an impact based on policy changes from the administration change. But I know that the semiconductor shortage is something that I've heard members of the administration speak and express concerns about. And they're not the first to express some concern over our dependence on East Asia for a lot of our electronics, going even beyond the rare earth issue. Yes, it's a complicated. My thoughts are complicated. I'll try to clarify them and get them out. So again, a lot of the much of the semiconductor manufacturing occurs in Taiwan, some in Japan, some in Malaysia, yes, some in China. But if you set China aside for the moment, these are countries that are friendly, that we have good relations with, and it's just that there are shortages. It's not guaranteed that having domestic supply would necessarily help with those shortages, except sometimes there is value in having things swing together. So right now we have some surging demand for these things. We're reasonably vaccinated in this country, less so in the other countries that are supplying some of these. And so when we're up, they're down, and that doesn't work very well in terms of making supply meet demand. If we had domestic production, that might have worked out better. But, listen, toilet paper is produced domestically, and we had huge runs on that. Food is, to a large extent, produced domestically, and we had problems there. And in both of those cases, it was also a sector issue. Toilet paper for homes was short. Toilet paper for offices and schools, we had an excess of it. It's on different machines that it's made. Food for restaurants and schools and hospitals and hotels, we were throwing into the fields, and food for consumption at home, there was some degree of temporary shortages on that. So it's not quite as simple as domestic versus international. I think there are bigger forces at work.
And any changes to the labor market that you think might be related to changes in the administration, Kim?
Probably not yet. Certainly the Biden administration has its eye on lots of changes they would like to make, particularly in regards to things like childcare and some other things we wouldn't normally sort of associate with being labor market policies, but that would have an impact. I mean, obviously the other big issue, or the thing that is still in play right now, but again, it's temporary, so I think it's less interesting, would be, enhanced unemployment benefits and stimulus checks. But those aren't going to be a long-term issue. Those are just again something about the transition.
Great. Another question for you, Greg, that has come in, and that is, how does the movement of the American economy away from manufacturing contribute potentially to these supply chain issues? And, maybe, I mean, have we in fact moved away from manufacturing, or is it just not as labor intensive as it once was?
It's both. We have the service sector makes up a bigger percentage of the economy than it did many years ago, and it has become less labor intensive. My thinking on that is somewhat similar. I mean, it depends what we're talking about. Are we talking about shortages of goods because we're shifting away from manufacturing? I think that's how I interpret the question. That's a little bit like related to my answer to the previous question. To the extent that it's manufactured somewhere and supply chains are working well, then it's not a major problem unless there's something inherent in it being overseas. Political turmoil or tariffs or something else that causes that overseas nature to be problematic. The one thing that it does oftentimes create challenges is the length of the supply chain. If we're trying to plan what we need, either raw materials or components or finished goods to sell to customers, if we have a relatively short supply chain that we can order something today and we get it in a couple of days or a week or even a month, that's a lot. You can be a lot more responsive to demand and ride the ups and downs more easily. If you have to order something 2, 3, 4, now if you're buying furniture or appliances 6, 8, 12 months out in advance, it's a lot harder to anticipate, and you get it wrong more often. You have excess inventory or shortages. So shortening the supply chain is helpful. Again, to the extent that everything is working smoothly in supply chains in normal times, it works out all right. Having a lot of what we buy from overseas, so long as we're able to afford that through other exports of services and other goods.
Got a labor market question from Michael Karolowitz. Can better collaboration between workers, employers, and government create the right employment growth at appropriate wages? And maybe I'll add, create a more effective matching market in the market for labor. Any thoughts on that, Kim?
Sure. I mean, there's certainly, if you look outside of the United States, there are other systems. For example, Germany has a famous one where workers have a bit more say in what goes on in the firms. Do they have better outcomes? Maybe, but maybe not. I mean, it's not. There's certainly the German system is not strictly better than the U.S. system. It's not obviously the U.S. system is strictly better than the German system. One of the issues at work goes exactly to this idea of matching, and that's the harder you make it to hire someone, the more expensive it is to hire them, or the more expensive it is to fire them, the less likely that person is to get hired in the first place. And when we're talking about matching, a lot of times what you want is for people to be able to kind of move across jobs, to be able to try a job out, and if it doesn't work, move to the next one. Now, one of the things that's unique to the U.S. system that does kind of hamper some of this turnover is the way health insurance works in the U.S. The fact that your health insurance is tied to your job makes changing jobs a bit precarious sometimes, and that's certainly something people have talked about in the context of trying to create better matches. Right? You get a better match by trying on more things. You go to buy a new T-shirt, you try on a bunch of shirts, and you buy the one you like. And so, to the extent that we have policies that make it harder to do this matching, harder to try out different jobs, or for firms to try out different workers, that can be problematic. And so, things that the governments when governments could do things to make that matching easier to do, that would be helpful. But there's always this tension between doing things that you think are good, things that are helpful. The European system, was famous at one point for making it very hard to fire people, and they thought this is great if you can't fire people and people have jobs, and and that'll be good for everybody. But if it's hard to fire somebody, then you don't really want to hire them unless you know for sure that that's the person you want to hire, and so those people don't get hired in the first place, and you end up with actually more unemployment from a system like that. And so, it's tough. It's a tough situation, and so things need to be done kind of very slowly and carefully. That's things like better technologies. Better. Think about how the internet has changed the way people look for jobs, and who knows, maybe we'll all be doing interviews on Zoom for jobs from now on, and so you won't have to get on an airplane and fly to Seattle to interview with a firm. Those are all things that, to the extent that those things are helpful in creating better matches, that would lead to ideally a more productive economy and a faster growing economy.
Yeah, interesting. There's that trade-off between, I think, a dynamic labor market that can create and reward people who hustle, and what labor economists called Eurosclerosis at one point. That's right. Which was how the firing costs that they legislated on employers actually stopped employers from hiring workers in the first place. That's right. The unintended consequences.
And those policies are great if you already have the job. It's hard for me to get fired, but if you're a young worker trying to get into the workforce, those policies make life very difficult. And the flip side of that is, in a dynamic place like the United States, there's just more volatility. You're more likely to lose a job or gain a job, and so there's just more bouncing around.
But less likely to live with your parents into your 30s. Question from Alyssa Robertson. Given the increased costs to hire employees, do employees have greater leverage at this point? And is that a short-term phenomenon, or do you think employees might have greater leverage long-term coming out of COVID?
Employees probably do have more leverage right now, and that's part of why, it's part of what we're seeing in wages. The fact that wages are going up are exactly to the point where, I don't know if you want to use a word like leverage, but they're to the extent that they're in scarce supply, then they're going to be rewarded more for showing up. And I'm sure we've all read the news articles about McDonald's offering $50 just to come in and take an interview. I have some friends who work at Sub-Zero, and they're offering $1,000 hiring bonuses, and wages are going up, and that's something that we would expect in a situation like this. Is it a long-term issue? If I was good at telling the future, I'd be rich and I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be on an island somewhere. But supply and demand will eventually equalize, and all of these kind of mismatches will fall back out again. We saw a big kind of mismatch of workers and firms coming out of the 2008 recession, which was particularly a particularly strong recession also. And there was some discussion about geographic mobility, that it was hard to, people were underwater on their mortgages. It was hard to move across places in order to go where jobs are. But that had all largely kind of sorted itself out by the time COVID came around, and that'll happen again. It's just, this might take a bit longer. And there are some kind of permanent things that have changed. One thing COVID has done is incentivized firms to come up with labor-saving technologies. A lot more ordering online, third-party delivery services, kiosks in restaurants to order from rather than people at the register. And more sophisticated labor-saving products as well. That will likely also change some of the long-term mix of what kinds of jobs we need, but probably not the overall level of employment.
Greg, question from Kaya Viney. Actually, two questions. I'm going to start with one on these logistical issues that pop up occasionally with truck driver shortages that are on a sector basis, or container shortages. How long will these things go on? Is that something that will resolve in the coming months, or is that going to be with us well into 2022? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm a little bit like him, a little hesitant to make too great of predictions, but I would say, let's just take the truck driver shortage in particular. There's been a bit of a truck driver shortage for some time in the country. So to the extent that a particular sector pulled back significantly and then is trying to build back up, that may take a while to overcome. Again, I'm not an expert in kind of the labor market dynamics there, so I'm not really sure about that. But to the extent there was already pressure in that area, that could take a little bit of a while. I'm sorry, what was the container?
Container shortages in the mismatch, is that going to resolve more quickly?
That one I think is in some sense it's a little bit easier because it's, a basic container is a little bit easier to manufacture than, say, semiconductors or things like that. So to the extent that we're operating in this country, we're able to ship things west across the Pacific Ocean, and to the extent that we come closer to kind of the recent level of trade between the two continents, I think that will work itself out reasonably well. And there may have to be some repositioning going on. And again, pricing may do some of that. There may be real incentives to ship containers the other direction, which might either greatly reduce cost or somewhat reduce costs of goods going that way. I don't know if I've ever seen actually incentive paid to send something the other direction, but I think pricing and a little bit of time can make that one work out a little bit more quickly.
Kaya also asked a question about underemployment, Kim, and I was wondering if you could just comment on how do we measure underemployment? Is that an important phenomenon in the economy, and how does it look right now based on information that you have?
Yeah, so maybe before we do underemployment, we should just remind everybody what it means to be unemployed. So when they do the surveys and they ask someone if they're employed or unemployed, you have to both not have a job right now, but also have been looking for work and be available for work. Right? So that's a fairly strict definition in some sense, but it's meant to capture the idea of someone who is in the labor force trying to find a job and can't find one. And they want to differentiate that from someone who maybe would like to work but hasn't looked for work, or would like to work but isn't available for work. And then also this idea that if I'm employed, whether I'm part-time or full-time, I'm considered to be employed. And so maybe we also want to think about people who are working part-time but would like to have a full-time job. So you could think about people who are working part-time when they wish they were full-time as being maybe underemployed. And then you can also think about these kind of what we call marginally attached workers. So these workers that aren't technically unemployed, and because they don't have, because they haven't looked for work in the past month, but have looked for work, in the past 6 months or the past 12 months. And so if we kind of take all those people, so we can get a bit of a sort of ballpark measure maybe of what this looks like. So in May, right, the official unemployment rate, those people who are unemployed and have looked for work, that number is about 5.8% in May. If we take all the unemployed people plus all the marginally attached people plus the people who are working part-time and wish they were full-time, that number goes up by about another 4 percentage points to about 10. So not quite, not double, but there's always, and that number kind of fluctuates. It goes up during recessions and comes down during, the gap between those two shrinks after recessions during recoveries. But yes, so we're seeing more marginally attached workers. We're seeing more people working part-time when they wish they were working full-time. And it's something like increasing. If you do want to take that broader measure of unemployment, it's taking us somewhere from about 6% to about 10%.
So I'm not underemployed if I just think I should have a job that's better than my current job.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think I'm not being paid enough. I don't know if that makes me underemployed or not, but I think most of us would agree with that definition of underemployment. Maybe Jeff Bezos is the only person who's not underemployed.
Right. No, good answer though. It's a serious phenomenon, and I know people wonder about that. Great question here from Steve Goldstein. And it's about the kind of return to office mindset. So many studies suggest 30% of workers are threatening to quit if they're required to return to the office full time. So how important is it to be offering remote work options in your opinion? And what do you think things are going to look like as this economy gets rolling again, and, concerns about COVID, let's say they do fade into the rearview mirror and the variants don't get too severe. What do you think things are going to look like? Will most people end up going back to pre-pandemic work norms, or will we see a significant share of the workforce working remote, at least, let's say between 1/3 and 2/3 of the time? Kim?
Yeah, this is a tough question to answer because we don't have great data on it. I see the question, the questioner has said about 30%. I've seen studies that say even larger numbers than that. 80% of workers would like to continue some kind of working from home. And
Yeah, and
my guess is,
I think
go ahead.
Steve is saying 30% of them say they're actually going to quit if they can't do it.
Well, yeah, that's the question whether they actually quit or not. But yes, absolutely. I think we're seeing there's going to be some adjustment here. This was something that I think in the long term probably would have happened at some point to some extent. Firms get to save on office space. Again, this would be a big adjustment. Right? A lot of firms have invested heavily in big office buildings and expensive office building and nice facilities because that's what people wanted. They wanted a foosball table and free Diet Cokes while they work. And now they would just rather be at home. So there's certainly something's going to happen there. Again, this goes back a bit to questions about leverage. So to the extent that some workers do have leverage, ones that are harder to find are going to be able to perhaps work more remotely. But there's also just a lot of jobs you can't do remotely, right? So you can't be a dentist remotely, not yet at least. You can't. Food service workers, restaurants, hotels. So there's a lot of services that just have to be provided in person and in offices largely. And so I would guess it's a somewhat small fraction of the population who have the sorts of jobs, the kind of business and professional services type jobs that you can do from home, or at least do from home part of the time. And yeah, that's something that I think firms and workers are struggling with right now. And to the extent that you have a happier workforce who's less likely to leave and maybe more productive, that would be something that you'd want to I think they're trying to kind of grapple with right now.
Yeah, I think it'll be a while before we really see the new equilibrium. But, I think for workers that feel like they're going to quit if they can't work fully remotely, it might be hard to find the firm that's going to hire you because the firms that allow that, I don't think are going to lose any workers. So there may not really be this, I think that the real issue is there's kind of potentially a shortage of opportunities to work remotely relative to the currently stated preference of workers, and how that gets resolved will, it'll play out. But yeah, it's an interesting situation and one that none of us have ever lived through, fortunately.
Yeah.
It's too bad we have to now. But, there might be some lasting productivity gains from this, and
certainly
maybe an economy that's a little easier on the environment, and that wouldn't be all bad. So we'll try to find the lemonade here. Question from Nathan. Is there a greater interest for academic programs and careers in supply chain management due to the pandemic? Greg DeCroix.
I can take that one. Yes. I can also say that I'm getting more calls from people, the press or people like Mike's team, to talk about these issues. It's certainly become a household name, household word that people are familiar with that they weren't before. Not always in the best context. I hope people don't blame supply chain for these problems. The supply chain is what it is. And like I said before, people are working really hard to make it work. Just as an example, we recently, we had an undergraduate specialization in supply chain management, and we turned it into a full-blown major, I guess, just under 12 months ago, beginning of this past academic year. And we have a larger number of students pursuing that than ever before. You open the door, Mike, a quick commercial. We have an undergraduate degree, we have a 1-year Master's of Science degree, and we have a 2-year specialization within our full-time MBA program. And we also are working with our executive education partners to work with companies on custom programs and things like that. So there are plenty of opportunities here at Wisconsin if anyone would like to know more about them.
And Kim, I'm sure the demand for economics is as high as ever.
Always. Anytime there's a recession, everybody wants to learn about how the economy works. So that's right. And we have great programs too. Send your kids to the University of Wisconsin. Have them be econ majors. They'll do fine in life.
Yeah, we sure do have great programs in supply chain and economics and many other areas. So I think we're going to wrap it there. I really want to thank both of you for coming back on the show. You've both been guests before, and you've always done a terrific job. Thanks for taking your time on a on a nice summer evening here in Wisconsin. I know that's not an easy ask, and we appreciate you answering the call. So thanks for sharing your insights tonight. It was a great program.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.
Great. So thank you for your great questions tonight. We had a very engaged audience as always, but this was even one of the better ones. Lots of great questions. We will be back again in 2 weeks on Tuesday, July 13th. Thanks for joining us this evening, and on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a badger. Because we badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a badger.